I'm Jeremy Parrish, and this is Game Boy World. Finally, a Game Boy launch title that doesn't demand apologies. Super Mario Land may not be the most spectacular game in the Mario series, but it's a good one, and that puts it at the high end of gaming's bell curve. Unlike Alleyway, Baseball, and Yakuman, Super Mario Land remains entertaining even 25 years later. It's an excellent platformer, even if it is a bit on the short and easy side. If you don't agree, well, I want you to pause, take a look in the mirror, and ask yourself, where did my life go so wrong? Unlike the system's other Japanese launch titles, Super Mario Land was the product of Nintendo R&D 1 alone. Intelligent Systems had nothing to do with the game, so far as the in-game credits indicate. I do love me some Intelligent Systems, but there's something to be said for a game developed by the same people responsible for the hardware it launches beside. Super Mario Land's producer was none other than Gunpei Yokoi, who not only spearheaded the Game Boy project, he had also worked on several previous Mario games. Before Super Mario Bros. Reinvented the series, and, for that matter, the games industry, Mario wasn't just Shigeru Miyamoto's baby alone. R&D 1 worked on a few arcade and NES Mario titles, including the original Mario Bros., which Yokoi had a hand in, and Wrecking Crew, which Mario Land director Satoru Okada directed. In a sense, Mario Land represented a homecoming for these Mario veterans. In the meantime, they, along with composer Hip Tanaka, had worked on games like Metroid and Kid Icarus, so they were certainly no stranger to the platform genre. So if Super Mario Land seems like a bit of a regression to older Mario, well, that's probably why. For Yokoi and Okada and crew, returning to Mario must have been a bit like coming back home to their hometown after 5 years to find it had suddenly become a booming metropolis. Everything had changed. Super Mario Bros. Changed everything. And the Mario Land crew acknowledged that. They acknowledged the things that had changed. But at the same time, they put their own spin on things. Which means that we have standard Mario concepts, like running with the B-dash and jumping on enemies, and collecting power-ups from bricks with flashing question marks on them. Super mushrooms make Mario grow taller. Starmen make him invincible. Flowers give him the ability to toss balls of destructive power. There are also some old-school Mario references. One of the first enemies you encounter in Super Mario Land is the Fighter Fly from Mario Bros., a creature that had been completely forgotten in the NES games. On the other hand, all those standard Mario elements work a little differently here. Mario's jump physics feel a little strange. Platforming has fussier edge detection, and you have a little more freedom to twist around in midair. The flowers here don't give you fireballs, they give you super balls, which bounce around the screen and gather coins for you, a feature that wouldn't fold back into the real Mario games until the Super NES. When you step on a turtle, he doesn't retreat into his shell for you to kick. Instead, his shell explodes. Bullet bill blasters rise from pipes to take potshots at you, something that never happened on the NES. There's an almost alien atmosphere to Super Mario Land. It doesn't take place in the Mushroom Kingdom. The action is set in the kingdom of Sarasaland, ruled by the nefarious Tatanga, who has kidnapped Princess Daisy. It's like Super Mario Bros., but everything is subtly off-kilter. Nintendo's localization choices add to the game's exotic feel. Where enemies like Kuribo and Noko Noko were changed to Goombas and Koopa Troopas in the NES games, their counterparts here, Chibibos and Nokobans, retain their Japanese names. It almost feels like Nintendo of America knew this chapter of the Mario saga was a one-off, and didn't want to bother coming up with new names. But it all works to the game's benefit. Sarasaland feels suitably strange. You begin in a world inspired by Egypt with pyramids in the background and a sphinx for a boss. Then you advance to a tropical island, a realm seemingly based on Easter Island, and eventually to the China-esque Chai Kingdom. Most of the new enemies here feel nothing like traditional Mario foes. There are big, hairy jumping spiders, angry Moai heads, and hopping Kyonshi ghosts. They're creatures more out of horror and traditional folklore than they are from the fantasy world of the Mushroom Kingdom. The Super Ball power-up bounces all around the screen, giving Mario the ability to take out enemies and collect coins with bank shots. 1-ups appear as hearts, not green mushrooms, but that's probably because everything on Game Boy is green. There are only 3 worlds per stage instead of 4, and each non-boss level ends with a pair of doors rather than a flagpole. If you can reach the upper door, which requires increasingly intricate footwork as the game proceeds, you get to play a quick bonus round that can net you up to 3 lives apiece. Oh, and 2 entire stages take the form of side-scrolling shooters. one underwater and one in the air. In fact, your final showdown with Tatenga plays out as a shooter. Admittedly, the shooting mechanics in Super Mario Land are pretty basic. The only power-up you can collect is the standard Super Mushroom, which simply lets you take a hit. You can blast through the scenery and through enemy formations while avoiding incoming fire, but there are no special weapons, no special abilities, and the combat isn't especially challenging. Really, Super Mario Land as a whole is pretty easy compared to the NES Mario games. It's also really short, a mere 12 levels versus the 32 in Super Mario Bros., and the expansive world map of Super Mario Bros. 3. But then, it's not like American gamers knew anything about Super Mario Bros. 3 at the time, right? The weird differences in Mario localization for the NES put Super Mario Land in a very different place on the Mario timeline for Americans than it had back home in Japan. In Japan, Mario Land was simply the fourth Mario platformer. Super Mario Bros. Came out in 1985, Super Mario Bros. 2 followed in 1986, and Super Mario Bros. 3 arrived and won hearts in 1988. In the US, though, we got Super Mario Bros. Around the same time as Japan, but since the NES was brand new at that point and took a couple of years to gain traction here, we never saw the real sequel. Instead, of course, the game we got as Super Mario Bros. 2 was a hack of a totally unrelated game called Doki Doki Panic, blah blah blah. You know that. But you may not remember that Super Mario Bros. 3 didn't make its way over here until early 1990, more than half a year after the Game Boy's launch. America didn't see the real Super Mario Bros. 2 until 1993, when it came out as the Lost Levels on Super Mario All-Stars for Super NES. Meanwhile, Super Mario USA, as our sequel was called in Japan, didn't make it back home until 1992. So, for the Japanese, Mario Land felt like a logical continuation of the standard Mario fare: linear, athletic, platforming. Maybe it was regressive in terms of size and scope, but it wasn't unexpected. The content was about what you'd think a Mario game should be if you'd played through the Mario trilogy on NES. For Americans, though, Mario Land felt like a continuation of the Mario series' weird mutability. The Egyptian theme of the opening level totally fit with the Arabian Nights vibe of Super Mario Bros. 2. Maybe it was regressive back to Super Mario Bros. 1 in terms of its format, but ultimately it was just another example of the anything goes feel of the series. Because it so neatly towed the line between familiar and weird, Super Mario Land made a great sequel in both Japan and America, but for completely different reasons. Of course, even though I said it's a game that doesn't demand apologies, there's no denying it feels very much like an early Game Boy game. It's so much more substantial and interesting than Alleyway or Baseball, yet it admittedly pales in comparison to its NES contemporaries, and to its own sequels. It was more in line with the kind of platformer you would have seen on NES, say in 1986-87, the kind of thing that followed right after Super Mario Bros., but, predated Mega Man 2, predated Castlevania 3, predated some of the big, adventurous, ambitious platformers, especially Super Mario Bros. 3. But again, remember what it was competing against in the portable space. I mean, the Super Mario Bros. Game & Watch? Tiger Electronics' terrible LCD adaptation of Simon's Quest? Frankly, there was no comparison between those games and Mario Land. No, as a first-generation portable game, Super Mario Land is frankly pretty amazing. It's short, it's easy, and it's limited, but it doesn't feel compromised. The screens are tiny on screen, but they're dense. Unlike most other early scrolling action games on the system, you have no trouble following the action, even on that crappy little screen. Over and above all else, Super Mario Land reflects Nintendo Research and Development 1's tradition of being experimental and weird, as fits their name. They were about research and development, and they were always throwing out new ideas. Where Shigeru Miyamoto's EAD team has always been more about coming up with some solid ideas than perfecting them through iteration, R&D 1 was always more about freewheeling creativity. Super Mario Land begat the far more impressive and adventurous Super Mario Land 2 6 Golden Coins, which mutated into Wario Land, which inspired WarioWare, which led to Rhythm Heaven. So it's not only a solid Mario adventure, it's also the inflection point for some of Nintendo's most inspired, not to mention weirdest, creations ever. Yeah, so Mario's sprite is tiny. Yeah, so you can finish the game in about half an hour. Forget all that, this was Game Boy's crowning achievement in April 1989. It was a Mario game on a low-priced handheld, and that means it was guaranteed to sell like gangbusters, millions of copies. Nintendo could have slacked off, but no, they went the extra mile to make sure that this game was worth the money. It was a console quality experience on a handheld so limited and underpowered that, at first glance, you'd think such things would appear impossible. On the other hand, the biggest shortcoming to Super Mario Land is that it is a console quality experience on a handheld. As such, it ended up being overshadowed by Tetris, which turned out to be a much better handheld experience because it lent itself so neatly to quick play sessions. Mario Land really demanded more attention, and, if you wanted to beat it, at least half an hour of time. It was a game better suited for long car trips and plane rides, whereas Tetris worked perfectly in short 5-minute bursts. Plus, there was the whole issue of Game Boy's screen. All that awful ghosting and blur made scrolling actions hard to swallow until Super Game Boy and Game Boy Pocket came along to lead us to the promised land. Ultimately, the majority of early Game Boy software would pursue the slow, scroll-free puzzle model, as pioneered by Tetris and Sokoban clone Boxel, simply because that style of game worked better for the platform. Not only for its limitations, but also just for the portability of it. Deep console experiences wouldn't really start to work on handheld systems until the DS and PSP came along, systems that allowed you to suspend a game and pick up exactly where you left off simply by closing the lid or hitting the sleep button. Nevertheless, Super Mario Land was a statement of intent. It was Nintendo's proud declaration that Game Boy could play games every bit as polished and worthwhile as any console, and with only 4 shades of gray to choose from at that. This was a fantastic kickoff for the system, and its sequels would only get better. For more on Game Boy's history, check out GameBoyWorld.com.